So today we're actually going to be discussing one of the maladaptive traits that comes from trauma, and that is triggers. When we hear the word triggers, that in itself can almost trigger us, because a trigger sounds like something that's automatic. It's like something on a gun, right? You pull it and then bam, the bullet is coming out of the gun. But is that really what a trigger is when we talk about psychology, we talk about trauma and overcoming trauma? What really is a trigger? Well, a trigger is essentially a sensitivity that's developed as a result of trauma that causes us to have an emotional reaction, right? So it's a sensitivity to something causes us to have an emotional reaction. And typically the triggers that are giving us problems are the ones that are causing emotions or feelings that we don't desire to have, like anxiety, like fear, like anger. And those undesirable emotions for us are so frustrating because we may feel like, well, I can't control this emotion when it comes up, or I don't know what to do when I feel this emotion, or it's so overpowering, or it tends to just overtake me. So people wonder what they can do about these triggers that they're experiencing. How can they minimize the triggers? How can they diffuse the triggers? Is that even possible? Well, it's good to think about what the triggers actually are. As I mentioned, they're a sensitivity to something. So when you look at a trigger in terms of being a sensitivity, that takes that sense of it being an automatic thing away from the word. So instead of saying I have a trigger, when you think of it as a sensitivity, I have a sensitivity to ABC. Then we don't necessarily have to look at it as being this automated thing. If that trigger gets pulled, bam, the bullet comes out of the gun. Because the reality of our emotions and our actions is that we have control over our actions, and our emotions can be managed. They can be observed. They can be understood. It is not necessary for us to give in, capitulate, and just lay down to any emotional feeling that we have. We don't have to be out of control. We can be in control. So just the fact that we feel a trigger or that we have a trigger is not enough to excuse any type of emotional reaction. It is our responsibility to manage our actions. It is our responsibility to manage the way that we respond. So instead of just reacting to a trigger, we want to do that. But how can we do that? Well, to understand how this is done, we have to understand what actually happened in a trauma. So a trauma situation is anything that violates the self or violates the values. A trauma is a violation of the self or the values. So when you were beat up by that group of people, or beat by your mother or your father, or attacked in some type of way, what you experienced was a violation of the self or what you value in life, which is in our subconscious mind synonymous with the self. We believe we are our values. And so a trigger is created during the traumatic situation. The trigger that's created is the brain taking a snapshot of everything it can sense, what it can hear, what it can see, what it can smell, what it can taste. And it says, anytime you smell, hear, taste, or feel these sensations, please go into emergency mode. So the brain says, check, aye, aye, Captain. So it takes a snapshot of everything that's happening at that time, and then it says, oh, later on, you smell something that reminds you of your attacker, bam, activates emergency brain in the mode, or emergency mode in the brain. You see someone that has the same haircut as your assailant, and bam, it activates emergency mode in the brain. Or you smell something, or you see something, like it can be anything from candy in a grocery store to shoes on a floor. It could be the way your partner touches you or the way they kiss you. It could be something someone says or how someone responds to your anger or how someone responds to their own anger. It could be the way they speak or manage themselves. It could be a sock on the bed. There are so many potential triggers. I could not possibly name them all. Why? Because triggers are infinite. Why? Because it was just whatever you took as a snapshot when you were experiencing your trauma. For those who are survivors of complex trauma, they went through repeated violations of themselves, repeated violations of their values. By experiencing repeated violations of the self, they've had to create in their mind a file list, a category list of different things that remind them, that can trigger them. And so you may not be conscious of what your triggers are. In fact, most people aren't necessarily until that trigger gets activated. And then they say, oh, wow, I have a trigger or a sensitivity to XYZ. Now I realize that. And some have found that it starts to get in the way of life. Now they're afraid to get on elevators. They're afraid to get on airplanes because these are triggers. They have issues in their intimate partner relationships because they get triggered. And they try to tell their friends and family, this triggers me and this triggers me. But it can be difficult to manage all the various types of triggers, right? And typically they come down to the ones that are undesirable are anxiety and fear or anger triggers. And that's typically what we're going to focus on talking about today, because those are the ones that seem to be the most perplexing and the ones that we would wish we knew how to get rid of. And we're going to talk about how you can get rid of your triggers. But it can be debilitating to live a life constantly riddled by worrying that something else is going to come up and trigger you. Something else is going to come up and make you feel anxiety or make you feel fear. And then what happens over time is you actually fear the fear. So it's like you already are feeling anxious if you're triggered into the anxiety, but then you start to fear that you will get triggered. So it goes from being afraid of bicycles to not even wanting to leave your house because there's going to be bicycles out there. And you're just afraid that you may get triggered. It comes from being afraid of crowds to not even going to a concert anymore because you're afraid you may get triggered. And so you start limiting yourself in your life. You start saying, okay, well, I don't like backpacks because backpacks remind me of bombs and I was in a war, so I'll drop out of school. And as you start cutting back on life because you're fearing the fear and you're anxious about the potential anxiety, well, now your life starts to become less and less enjoyable because you have less and less freedom. And then it actually leads to depression. So your anxiety has now given way to depression. And now you're actually not happy and you're sad all the time. And you're irritable because you're triggerable. It ultimately spirals into a bad situation that just goes from bad to worse. Why? It's as a result of allowing triggers to manage your life. How can you deal with the triggers? Well, what you don't want to do is constantly sacrifice freedom for safety. You'll notice that safety comes at a cost. And often that cost is freedom. Even when you put on a safety belt in your car, it comes at a cost. You can't move around your car like you would be able to. Locking your doors comes at a cost. You can't just run in your house easily. These barriers limit your freedom. Now, we feel that they're certainly worth the sacrifice of freedom, so we do them. We wear our safety belts. We put locks on our doors. Okay, yeah, it's going to be an inconvenience, but it's worth it for the safety. But what happens when you start trying to gain the safety, but you're limiting yourself too much? So now you're saying, I don't want to go to the mall anymore. I don't want to go to school anymore. I don't want to work outside the home anymore. I don't want to do relationships anymore. I don't want to have sex anymore. I don't want to sing anymore. I don't want to dance anymore. I don't want to smile anymore. You're limiting yourself and limiting yourself and limiting yourself until you're not even alive anymore. In order to enjoy life, in order to live to our fullest potential, we have to get out of survival mode. We cannot live just purely in survival mode and expect to fulfill our potential or expect to accomplish anything that we can be proud of. No one gets to the end of their life and says, I'm glad I survived up until now. That's not, that you're not going to be proud of that. So you have to get out of survival mode. You have to get out of thinking that your life is about avoiding triggers. So to that end, the idea that many people have where they say, hey, listen, if anyone here is going to talk about anything that could trigger me, I need you to say, hey, trigger warning. And then I know that I could be triggered and I can avoid the situation. That's not going to work. The more you avoid your trigger, the more scary the trigger becomes. Asking everyone in your surroundings to tell you and warn you that you could be potentially triggered is not going to work. I'm sorry. That may trigger you. But the reality is you cannot live your life expecting everyone to know what your triggers are. It's impossible. We don't all know what each other's triggers are. It's impossible. A water bottle could trigger someone. Water can trigger someone. Air can trigger someone. We don't know. So the answer isn't to change the world around you. The answer isn't to control everyone in your environment. The answer is to learn to change yourself. To learn to control yourself. That's how you learn to manage the trigger. Let's go more into detail into what you actually have to do in order to be able to diffuse these triggers. If you think about raising a child, let's say you have a young child and you're carrying them, and then bam, a balloon pops. And that young child, maybe they're 2, 3 years old, they start screaming because the balloon popped, and this is just the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to them as far as they're concerned in this moment. So now what you notice, the next time you bring a balloon around the child gets scared, and they get frightened. What you realize happened is a trigger has been created. Now the child is afraid of balloons. Or there was one story of a child who got on the elevator with the mom, but when the mom got off the elevator, the child was distracted and the doors closed very fast, and the child was trapped in the elevator and ends up going to another floor and loses his mom. Now, he got reunited with his mom, but after that, he developed a trigger. When he would see elevators, he wouldn't want to go near them. In fact, he started asking his mom, where are we going? Is there going to be elevators there? A trigger was created. Now, if you had a son or a daughter that was afraid of balloons or afraid of getting on an elevator, what would you do for that child? Would you conclude that, oh, my child is afraid of balloons, so for the rest of its life, we will always try to keep all balloons away from this child? Or would you say, no, my child's afraid of elevators, so for the rest of its life, we will always take the stairs as a family to avoid ever putting this child on an elevator again? Well, if you take that route, you can see how incredibly inconvenient that would become. You would give up your freedom to create a sense of safety. But ultimately, it's not even adaptive, is it? Because it won't allow the child to excel in life, to succeed, to reach his or her potential, because you've created this limitation based on the trigger. So what would you do to diffuse the trigger for your child? Instinctually, most of us understand exactly what we would do. We would assure the child that the child is safe, and we would bring a balloon back around the child. And we show the child, see, it's okay. And the child at first is going to have an increase in anxiety and start crying. But then if you take your time with the child, and you keep letting the child see that the balloon is fine, eventually the child will touch the balloon, and he'll fuss a little bit, he'll go back and touch the balloon again, and he'll start playing with the balloon, and then you can take the balloon away and bring another balloon in, and what's going to happen? Eventually the child is desensitized to the balloon. It works, right? Well, of course, so many parents in here can agree, can attest to the fact that this works. So what have we done? We've actually managed the trigger. We've we've diffused the trigger, we've cured the child of their phobia by using exposure. What would you do with the elevator? You would use the same technique, wouldn't you? You'd say, well, it's okay. You're going to hold on close to mom or dad, and we're going to go on the elevator. See, it's safe. See, I'm right here. And what you're doing is you're assuring the child of the safety, but at the same time, you're showing them this is illogical. You don't have to have a fear the rest of your life of an elevator. You don't have to have a fear the rest of your life of a balloon. It is okay. You can get through this. It's safe. And we're going to do this together. And so by riding the elevator again and again and again, what eventually happens? The child becomes desensitized to the elevator, and their trigger is cleared up. Triggers are sensitivity. You know exactly what you must do to diffuse your triggers. Because when it comes to sensitivity with food, like if I said, hey, listen, you're going to need to desensitize yourself to spicy food so that you can eat food with more spice. What would you do to do that? Avoid all spicy food? Is that going to desensitize you? No. You're going to eat spicy food more often. By eating spicy food more often, it is your expectation that you will become more used to it. As you become more used to it and adjusted to it, you become desensitized to it. You have diffused the trigger. You know exactly how to diffuse a trigger. It's through exposure. The more you expose yourself to it, the less power it will have. This idea that we have, where intuitively we think, well, I need to avoid the things that are upsetting to me. I need to avoid the things that cause me anxiety. This is the prompt of your subconscious mind, because your mind goes into emergency mode when you are triggered. So that's what it's telling you. Your subconscious mind's like, get away from that thing. It's trying to keep you safe. Don't allow your subconscious mind to lead you. It's the animal brain. It is dumb. It doesn't know the difference between whether you're dreaming or you're awake. It just gives you emotions. It doesn't know the difference between whether this is truly safe or if this is just something that reminds you of the trauma, or if you're in an actual trauma. It doesn't know the difference. It has a snapshot of the things you saw, the things you smelled, the things you heard. When it feels or hears those things again, it doesn't know that you're not in the trauma. For some people, it's just recalling their trauma, just talking about it triggers them. That's because the subconscious doesn't know that that's not the trauma. So it's saying, oh, we're in a trauma situation, protect the self. And it dumps chemicals into your system, right? And it's got you all, oh my God, the anxiety is too much. I can't handle this. Yes, you can. If you recognize that you're being triggered at a time where you're actually safe, so you're feeling unsafe, when you actually are safe, you have to diffuse the trigger. How do you do that? Exposure. You have to reassociate in your mind whatever the supposed danger is, whatever the trigger is, with safety. You have to help the mind to recognize that this is a safe situation. It is not in any danger. How do you do that? Exposure. There are two types of exposure. There's flooding and there's gradual. You can pick which one you want. Flooding exposure is where you just push yourself into the situation all the way in. You let the anxiety spike sky high and you just ride it out until your brain realizes you're actually safe. So people have done this for like heights or for getting past being afraid of the dark. Go up really high, just expose yourself to the situation. And then suddenly, what will happen? Well, after the anxiety spikes for a few moments, you start to calm down, you become more and more calm, and then you realize there is no danger. And your brain reassociates the sights, the smells, the sounds, everything associated with that trigger, reassociates it with safety, and you're good to go. Is it that simple? Yes, it really is that simple. Is it easy? Well, apparently not. That's why people tend to stay closed up and afraid, because of this trigger, they don't want to feel anxiety. They don't want to feel scared. They don't want to feel anger. So they don't expose themselves to the trigger. But by exposing yourself, you can retrain the brain. The other way that you can use exposure is through graduality. Gradual exposure is a technique you can use that will help you to manage that fear of the fear that you have. So let's say I'm afraid of scissors, or scissors for me is the trigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some scissors and I'm just going to put myself next to the scissors first. I'll allow the anxiety to spike and I'm going to sit through it. You have to work through triggers, not avoid the trigger. Once I feel calm enough, then I will go to the next step. The next step will be to touch it very briefly. So I'll touch the scissors very briefly, let the anxiety spike and work through it. Then I'll hold my hand on the scissors. When that doesn't bring up any anxiety anymore, then I'll pick up the scissors and put it down. This is graduality. When that doesn't bring up anxiety anymore, then I will hold the scissors. If I feel my anxiety spiking, what do? Work through it. You don't defuse a trigger by giving up and running away. You have to work through the trigger. Okay, I'm safe right now. Once I become bored, because that's what comes immediately after realizing that there's nothing to be afraid of, then I can go ahead and begin to use the scissors. Next thing I know, the phobia is gone. The fear is gone. The trigger is diffused. You can use this in every type of triggering situation. If you know what the trigger is and you identify it, you can work through it. Sometimes it's not something as concrete as a scissors though. It can be something that causes you anger or fear, like the way that your partner clenches their jaw. Or it can be something in a sexual relationship with your spouse that causes you discomfort. When they do this a certain way, it reminds you of when you were raped. It causes you discomfort. How do you work through that trigger? Well, what you want to not do is the avoidance. The fight, flight, freeze. Don't do that. So fighting would be, get off of me. Don't do that. That's not going to help you to get past the trigger. So distinguish fight. Don't do flight. I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm sorry. And then you leave. That's flight. Don't do flight. Don't do freeze. Freeze is where you just disappear inside of yourself. You're just gone. Your partner's like, hello? Are you there? Hello? What happened? Where'd you go? That's freeze. Don't do fight. Don't do flight. Don't do freeze, because those are trauma responses being activated by the amygdala. You have to go into your prefrontal cortex and observe. How do you do that? Well, your prefrontal cortex is slow. It's not the first thing that responds in a trauma. It's not designed for that. Prefrontal cortex is for analyzing situations, for strategizing, for critical thinking, for deep thinking and controlling the emotions. That sounds like where you want to be, but it doesn't activate right away. So the only way to be able to use the prefrontal cortex in what your trauma brain is telling you is a trauma or a trigger situation is to wait. Because this part of your brain takes about 5 seconds to come online. So you have to use the rule of 7 seconds. So when your partner clenches their jaw, or when you're in a sexual situation and something triggers you, you need to pause 7 seconds, 5 to 7 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Woo! Prefrontal cortex lights up. It says, hey, what's going on here? Your prefrontal cortex is where the conscious self lives and operates. Conscious self is free will. Free will is choices. Choices requires critical thinking. This is the boss. This is the person you want leading you. The problem of living a traumatized, triggered life is that you're always in this brain back here, the animal brain, just trying to survive. Don't allow your animal brain to lead you. You wouldn't allow the dog to be the head of the household. You put the person in charge. You, the conscious self, in your prefrontal cortex. That's who you want to come online. So be patient. Let the boss show up. Okay? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The boss lights up and says, okay, what's going on here? And then you can finally start working through it with logic. Okay, I feel triggered, but I'm not actually in danger. So you observe the environment and the emotion. Let the emotion work through you. If you're feeling angered, you don't need to react. You don't need to act. You need to analyze. Because anger is an action emotion, but it's used to cover the more vulnerable emotion. Whenever someone gets angry, it's really that they're covering extreme sadness, extreme pain, extreme hurt, extreme humiliation, extreme embarrassment, extreme fear, extreme anxiety. Is that they feel an emotion that's too much for them, so they go into anger mode, because anger is the shell, it protects the self. Rah! Anger has a place. The place of anger is action. When it's not a time to take action, it's not a time to be angry. So don't go into anger when it's not an appropriate time to take action. Go back to your vulnerable emotions. So as soon as you feel triggered and you're like, I want to get angry, count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Allow the prefrontal cortex to light up and analyze the situation. Whoa, I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. That's all. You're sitting completely still, but you're thinking and analyzing. I'm feeling anger right now. Not I'm being angry. I'm not yelling. No action. Give it 5 to 7 seconds. Be in control. Become present. Observe the emotion. Wow, I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. It passes. The chemicals go through the system. It is emotion, energy in motion. It's going to go through you. You have to work through your trigger. Not run from it. Work through the trigger. Give yourself the time. 5 to 7 seconds. I'm observing that I feel anger right now. Why? I was triggered. Why? The way my spouse responded. It's the way they clenched their jaw. It was the way they touched me. Okay. Now, if it's in an intimate partner situation, you might say to your partner, hold on a second. Okay, I notice I have a trigger here. Can you try that again? Instead of saying to your partner, don't do that, you're going to say, hold on. I notice there's a trigger here. Can you try that again, but go slow? Have them do the very thing that triggers you again. Work through the trigger, and you will defuse the trigger. How many times will you have to do it? It's different for everyone. But it helps when you are absolutely convinced of your safety in the situation. So take your time, be patient, and when possible, if you have a safe person to work with, a friend, a family member, or a therapist, work through your trigger with the therapist or that friend or family member. Say that again. You said something that triggered me. Hold on a second. Breathe. 5, 7 seconds. Can you say that again? Let him say it again to you. I'm observing, I'm noticing how that makes me feel. This is mindfulness, right? That animal brain doesn't know if you are in the trauma or not, so you can't listen to that. You cannot allow your life to be led by that. The only time you need to be led by the animal brain is when you are in an actual emergency. If you see a rattlesnake, okay, run, flight, right? If you're being attacked, okay, fight. It has a place, right? But you can't be led by that. The majority of your life, 80% of your life, needs to be led by the conscious mind instead of the subconscious. But scientists say that most people live 96% in their subconscious brain. You must stop that. You must wake up and be conscious. Be mindful. Where am I? What is this? Oh, this apartment is nice. Oh, wow, I have a roof over my head. I have my own bed. Pay attention to everything. Oh, what is this? Why do I do this? Why do I brush with my right hand? Be mindful, and that will help you. If you're mindful and present in every moment, it'll help you to observe the trigger rather than react to the trigger. If you allow the subconscious brain to go and lead your reaction, it's going to be 1/12 of a second and you're gone. Just, oh! And your fight, flight, freeze, fawn, you're just gone. And then you later got to go back and be like, I'm sorry for my actions. Let's stop having to apologize. We don't have to apologize when we control ourselves in the moment. You have agency, you have free will, you are in control, you are powered, you are empowered. Okay? So use the rule of 7 seconds and flood or gradually expose yourself to your trigger. Be patient, use consistency and repetition. You will diffuse the trigger. You will no longer have to live your life in fear. When fear is now only 15%, the other 85% of your existence gets to be love. That's where you want to live. In the dream state, in the creative mind. That's where you want to live. So let's diffuse our triggers and let's get back on that horse. Because I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, get back on your horse. But it actually comes from a longer phrase, which was get back on the horse that bucked you. Which means the very horse that threw you, that bucked you, when you fall down, bam, and you hit the ground. And you're like, oh man, that hurt. I'm never riding a horse again. You are supposed to get back on that very same horse right then and there. That's where the phrase comes from. Get back on that horse. Why? Because they knew, even back then when they created that phrase in the old West, I would assume, that if you don't get back on the horse that bucked you, you're not going to have transportation. You're not going to be able to work. You're going to lose your freedom. You need to confront the fear, get back on that horse, tame that horse, become one with the horse, so that you will be in control and you can be free and live your life.